All right, YouTube, I thought this would be a good time to talk about climate change, climate disruption, global warming, the new ice age, all of these things that people are throwing around right now. Right now, it's actually snowing quite a bit outside. I'll show you if I can get the camera over there without destroying things. Yeah, it's snowing. It's pretty cold outside. In the 20s at the moment, which is, for Vermont, it's not that cold, but still, most people would be freezing. And I'm out here without any shoes on. But the data behind climate change, they claim there's a broad consensus, and there is in the scientific community. Most people who study climatology and so forth, they do believe that global warming is real and that it's largely man-made, or at least about half and half man-made and natural. You've got to understand something, though. Until about the late 1980s, the broad scientific consensus was that we were going to enter another ice age, and that we had actually almost run out of time in this relative warm cycle that we're in. You've got to understand the Earth's climate, and all the core samples and everything make this plain and clear. Our climate tends to have long-scale shifts back and forth between very cold periods, the larger of which involve essentially the extension of glaciers and tundra. In North America's case, as far south as I believe Kentucky, or nearly there around. And the smaller cycles of which still last decades or centuries and involve temperatures which are 5 to 10 degrees below normal. There was a little ice age not that long ago that I believe actually that coincided with the medieval era and the plague and all of the other problems. Crops failed, people were starving because it was colder than normal. I might have my years wrong. It was either then or during the Renaissance period. But they're around. So you've got to understand, when people talk about scientific consensus, that consensus is not necessarily true. It's based upon pure observation of evidence, which is good. Science generally operates quite well. And in non-theoretical circles, when you're dealing with something like chemistry or biology, genetics, something like that, this is almost invariably a good thing. But the scientific consensus in any field is subject to theories which look very good. They do explain large amounts of the observable evidence, but they're still wrong. You can look at the eugenics movement, you can see where biology and sociology and psychology fused, and they believed, oh, well, if we just keep the poor lower classes from replicating and we encourage people that are more quote-unquote genetically healthy, we encourage them to breed, well, the human race will be much improved. Of course, looking at modern genetic studies, it doesn't really make that much sense, at least within the context of within a given racial group. So it got discarded. It didn't really make sense, and the consensus changed from yes, this is a good thing to yes, this is a bad thing. The same within psychology, the use of electroshock therapy, the use of ice baths, the use of putting people for long periods of time in a sanitarium or an asylum was once seen as the consensus of science involved with these fields, with psychology, psychiatry, and so forth. They believed that was good. They believed it was effective, and this changed to now the modern system whereby people are hospitalized if they need to for short periods and given medication. They're given outpatient treatment, and it works a lot better. It cleaned out the asylums, it cleaned out the sanitariums. Bloodletting was once seen largely by what you would then call the scientific community as a good thing. It was seen as helpful. The four humors theory, the miasmatic theory, all of these things were once part of what you would call for those times science. We look upon the modern scientific community and we say, well, this is different now. We're in the age of space travel and the internet and all of these things. It's no different. Because for every theory that is true, and it's true and evidence suggests that it's true and there's a consensus that it's true, there will be other theories that look good, that make sense given the thought of the times, but nonetheless are wrong, and they're later shown to be wrong. What we don't know now, because while there is a general consensus, the general consensus is this, that the climate is warming, that mankind is at least about half responsible for this warming, that part of it might be natural, but most of it, or at least about half of it, is man-made. It's the result of industry. This, however, doesn't make sense given a few things that we now observe that were quietly hushed up, by the way. Number one, that the global temperature averages have been virtually the same for the last 20 years. They are not going up. Some climatologists suggest that this is because the ocean is absorbing the bulk of the heat, and they show various measurements for that. That's possibly true. It's not certain, though. There's also the suggestion that the CO2 increase that we see is actually the result of warming. That is, they're getting it backwards. Rather than, oh, we're creating more carbon dioxide, it's causing the globe to warm. There's also the suggestion among certain groups that it could be that the CO2 levels are rising precisely because the globe is naturally warming. I look at CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and the ozone layer, and I say, my goodness, it sounds like depleting the ozone layer could have been a much bigger impactor on our climate than the result of a small increase in carbon dioxide. And I say that because if you look at the temperature models, around the time that we were pumping the ozone layer full of CFCs and depleting the ozone in the layer, the temperatures were rising. Now we've cracked down on CFCs. There are only a handful of countries on Earth where they're still routinely used in refrigeration systems. Their use is extremely controlled now. Very, very little CFC escapes into the ozone layer, and the ozone layer is slowly repairing itself. And the temperature's stabilized. And I'm not sure that anyone in the scientific community has really looked at this as a factor. What you've got to understand is there are multiple factors involved. What's not clear is if any of these singular factors, carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, which, by the way, agriculture, particularly beef cattle, release an enormous amount of methane into the atmosphere. Natural warming, a sort of retroactive warming cycle where regardless of the primary warming, there's now methane being released from frozen peat bogs and shit up in Siberia that's spewing out methane. There are many different, and the sunspot cycle, various solar maximum, solar minimum, magnetospheres, and all this cosmic material. It could be that any single issue is responsible for climate instability. It could be that they're all responsible for climate instability. Or it could be that this is a purely naturalistic cycle, and the reason that we perceive this as being largely man-made is because we're looking at a very tiny sliver of human development. And we're extrapolating. We've got, before the scientific revolution, we've got very little data on the climate of this Earth that we can't get from either ice core samples or tree rings or something of that nature. We can look at those and we can make educated guesses. We don't have exact numbers, but we can extrapolate from there and get a fairly good view of the Earth's past. What we do know is that we've had ice ages before. We've had warm periods before. That suggests to me that largely this is a naturalistic cycle, and that we really have very little control over it. In fact, you could make an argument. I've actually seen people say this, and while it's probably not true, it is intriguing nonetheless. There are some who suggest that we'd already be in another ice age if it weren't for industry. That is, that the slight amount of artificial warming that we've given the Earth has actually held off the next ice age. You can argue over whether this is good or not. Of course, if we suffered through global warming, and we had more hurricanes and tidal forces and all this material, that would probably not be good for certain areas of the world. For other areas, it would actually be fairly good. For instance, Canada, has an enormous area of arable land that would become more arable if the globe were to warm several degrees. The Great Plains agriculture would spread several hundred miles further north. Canada would become a breadbasket. Their population would probably do fine. Whereas in areas marginal to certain deserts, they would turn into deserts. They would wither away and dry up. So even though there's a broad scientific consensus that the globe is warming and that man is largely to blame for this, that consensus could change. Of course, anyone suggesting that is called a climate change denier. They're called a Bible thumper sometimes. They must be on the Bush bandwagon, etc., etc. The fact is that there's at least some evidence that does not bear out the concept of man-made global warming, including the fact that the temperatures on this planet have stalled out and stabilized for about a decade and a half, 2 decades now. And again, the consensus before global warming entered onto the world stage as part of the paradigm of talking about climatology. Before that, the consensus was, and this was generally regarded as true, it was held as true, the scientists believed it, was that we were going to hit another ice age fairly soon. And you look at the news today, it's snowing in Egypt, it's snowing in Israel, it's snowing in places where you get snow maybe once every century or so. You look at the massive storm system and the massive bubble of cold air over the United States. You look at the UK, which has hit several deep freezes lately. You look at the instability there with the climate, and you say, the global warming folks are saying, well, this is actually due to global warming. It's just destabilizing, but as a trend, it's going to continue to warm. Then you look at other fields and they say, well, we're destabilizing largely because it's not actually man-made, it's due to solar cycles. Then you look at other groups and they're saying we're going to hit another ice age. Within the next 10 to 20 years, we'll be at a minimum. The globe will be 5 to 10 degrees cooler, and many, many people will starve and suffer because, of course, marginally arable areas in Europe, Northern Europe specifically, one of the world's breadbaskets, the northern plains of the United States, the Canadian plains where they do most of their agriculture in the center of their country, southern Saskatchewan and so forth, that these areas will no longer be useful for several decades for farming. The glacier, and you look at the Arctic ice in 2012, it never really depleted itself and continued to grow well into the summer months, and now is at its I think the highest extent in like a decade. You look at all of this data and you find it difficult, or at least I find it difficult, to agree with the scientific consensus based on pure observation. Again, could be that they're right. It could be we are causing global warming. But I look out the window at the snow out there. I look at all of this data of temperatures being stable for several decades and not increasing. And then I look at Egypt right now or Israel and I say it doesn't really seem like the globe is warming. It seems more like we're simply destabilizing. And global warming has kind of turned into global climate instability. Anyways, I think they realized that to the average person, it wouldn't make sense to term it global warming because the temperatures weren't increasing. So they changed it to global climate instability. Their predictions, however, have turned out partially to be false. They were predicting, for instance, a larger number of much more powerful hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean brewing and heading towards the southern United States. This hurricane season was virtually empty. Instead, it was the Pacific that was getting pounded. There were multiple typhoons that headed up around Japan, coastal China. The Philippines, of course, got completely pounded by one of the strongest storms that's ever hit the planet, certainly in the Pacific theater. Obviously, their models can't be completely accurate because they weren't predicting this. They were predicting that the Atlantic side was going to get bombarded. The Atlantic side, we had basically no hurricane season. It snowed in central Texas, which happens once in a blue moon, and it's snowing in Egypt. This doesn't really make sense. You can say, yes, the climate's no longer stable because we're causing warming. You can also say the climate's no longer stable based on solar activity. You can say the climate's no longer stable because it's simply in part of a natural cycle and we're about to hit another ice age. That this kind of weather that we're seeing, snow in North Africa, snow in the central Middle East, huge storms in the Americas and Europe that cause flooding and feet of snow and sub-zero temperatures, you could make the other argument that that will become the new norm, at least for a period, and that this is a mini ice age. You could even go so far as to say it's a totally apocalyptic scenario where I'm not hitting a little ice age, we're hitting one of the major ice ages. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. And glaciers are going to start moving down south in the Americas and Europe and Russia and just pile drive everything underneath them and be, half a mile thick. They don't know because it's speculation. They're looking at available evidence and they're making a conclusion. But science has done this before. The consensus view is not always correct. The consensus view was in the 80s we were going to hit another little ice age. The consensus view in the 1920s is that eugenics was a good idea. It was sort of a Lamarckian sort of evolutionary theory. It never made much sense to some people, but a lot of people embraced it. The consensus was that taking schizophrenic people and putting them in ice baths was a good idea up until about the 1980s. Consensus view was that it was good to sterilize minorities up until the 1970s. This is science. Science is not always correct. Science learns from its mistakes and it manipulates its own findings and makes better and better theories to explain evidence. But that doesn't mean that any given paradigm within science at the time that it's proposed is correct. Global warming may be true. It may be that we are warming the earth, that this instability that I can see out the window right now is the result of man-made climate change, that we're pumping things full of CO2 and that's causing this instability. It could be that that's wrong. But it's become such a politically partisan, politically motivated debate that it makes it so that it's difficult for anyone, even in the scientific community, to challenge this with new findings. It would take a monumental change, a monumental paradigm shift, involving some of the better climate scientists probably, finding something very disturbing and then putting it out to the public. Of course, again, there was that story just earlier this year. I believe it was all over scientific articles, but then for some reason it never really hit the mainstream media other than Fox, and it was quickly lambasted there, that the temperatures on this globe, and I didn't know this, I bought into the stuff of, oh, well, it's been increasing every year, or it's getting warmer and warmer. It turns out the average temperatures yearly haven't really increased. We're getting hotter summers, we're also getting colder winters. That's more instability than actual warming, and I don't understand why people don't understand this. It's just nonsensical when you have this sort of church of global warming, and yet the globe's not actually warming. It doesn't really